Okay, we're going to move on to Michael, who's using JavaScript and Cloud Flows to download files from a SharePoint document library and Power Pages, bringing it all together. Michael,
All right.
feel free to take on over.
Thank you, David. Let me just start sharing my screen here. So guys, I'm just going to begin with a quick presentation because I wanted to explain a bit of how things work behind the scenes on the Power Pages world, because I think some people, it's not that familiar for some people as if it was a model-driven app or Power Apps and things like that. So if you guys don't know me yet or don't follow me, if you want to get in touch, you can find me on LinkedIn and Twitter. Feel free to reach out to me after the presentation. But what's all this about? The agenda for today is I'm going to go through initially the extensibility options for Power Pages, and then explore the two options to integrate Power Pages out of the box with SharePoint, and why we can't do it in the scenario that I wanted to demo, and the solution with Cloud Flows. And after that, I'm going to go through a quick demo and explain how all the pieces link together. So to extend Power Pages and customize and to expose data from Dataverse, basically we have the low-code options that everyone have heard. For example, we have the same abilities as we have in model-driven apps to expose forms and views into the Power Pages site. So we can use what we call entity lists and the basic forms and multi-step forms, which are simply views and forms that you configure in Power Pages, but at the end of the day, you have a model-driven app form set up on the background for those. Okay, it's like if you have a form in a model-driven app, you can expose it in Power Pages. But the only problem with this is that customization options, they are very limited. It's really easy to set up, but you cannot do a lot of custom code on top of them. You can do a few customization in rules and fields behaviors using jQuery or JavaScript. And you can also do, if you want to create full custom pages in Power Pages, you can leverage jQuery or JavaScript if you want to go through vanilla.js to do full code customizations. You can also use PCF controls as you use for Canvas apps or model-driven apps. And the advantage of doing custom pages like that is that you can call the Power Pages Web API. So it enables you to have all the power as you would be using the standard Dataverse Web API. There's a few limitations on that, but it's kind of, 80% of what the Dataverse Web API does, you can do with the Power Pages Web API. And you can also create custom pages in Power Pages using Liquid. That's an open source server-side language. Imagine like when you create an ASP.NET MVC page where you have the Razor language to create the pages. So you basically run Dataverse data and you can customize how it looks using Liquid. You can inject HTML tags and create pages with read-only purposes and also run fetch XML queries. But then comes a question. If I am customizing Power Pages so much with custom code and HTML and all of that, why would not I use a full custom web app instead? I see like the advantages, if you are building pro code customizations on top of Power Pages, it's similar to what you have in SharePoint. So if you are going to build a custom, very complex SPFX web part, the good thing is you leverage the standard SharePoint web APIs, the REST APIs, you leverage the security model as well. So for example, in the case of Power Pages, it's very similar. So you can configure you can configure data access using the table permissions in Power Pages, and all those pro code options, they will respect your permissions. So basically, it makes life easier in terms of enabling access to Dataverse data. And the scenario that I envisage as more powerful for Power Pages is obviously when you want to create a custom public website with Dataverse data. You can create, obviously, same sites for internal use, but in my opinion, I see the more potential to create those for public-facing websites. So you don't need to reinvent the wheel on creating public websites to expose Dataverse data. And then, as I mentioned, we have already some integration with SharePoint that is out of the box in Power Pages. We have the SharePoint libraries integration in Power Pages, but there's a dependency on the model-driven apps integration with SharePoint. That's basically you have to enable that. You can enable that integration with SharePoint on the model-driven app side. If you want to enable attachments in database records in SharePoint. So basically, you expose SharePoint files in the model-driven apps that can then be seen in Power Pages, but they are tied only to the records you linked them. So, for example, and also you have a problem here that if you want to enable it, you have to be a global admin. Otherwise, you can't enable. So like a normal person cannot simply link a Power Pages site to SharePoint without having global admin's permissions. There is a problem on this, is that let's say if you wanted to pick a random document library to expose in Power Pages without having that connection enabled, you can't do it out of the box. So for example, one scenario where we wanted to expose a bunch of PDF files or documents in our Power Pages site so that people can download the documents as document templates or something like that. You couldn't do it with this integration because it's tied only to those Dataverse records. So you cannot browse the libraries, basically. You can enable integration with Power Pages easily with SharePoint lists if you want. So like there's a new feature called the virtual tables where you can expose a table from SharePoint list or a SQL Server table as a Dataverse table in Power Pages or Dataverse. It works exactly like you have business connectivity services in SharePoint to expose SQL data or external data. But the disadvantage is, even though you can pick any SharePoint site you want and then you can browse, you can only see lists. So like for a site that I used to this demo, for example, there's only one SharePoint library here and you cannot see it because it's enabled and available only for lists. And what we do then, for example, if we can't leverage this, but there's other options around, and the best option that we could use and to build a quick solution would be Power Automate, because you can leverage Power Automate integration with lots of other data sources, and SharePoint is one of them. So if you want to integrate anything with Power Pages now, especially data sources that they don't exist out of the box with an integration in Power Pages, you can then call a Power Automate flow that integrates with the data source you want and return the results to the Power Pages site. You could actually do it previously in the past, but the problem is you needed to use the HTTP connector, and then the HTTP connector didn't have any sort of authentication there. And now you have a new Power Pages connector that you can leverage to do the same, but it secures the calls into Power Automate to make sure that only the authenticated users can call your Power Automate flows. If you want to play around with it, you can use a developer plan, but it's just important to have in mind that whenever you are going to put it on production sites, Microsoft recommends you to have a Power Automate per flow license in production, just for scalability and all of other similar issues. And then before the demo, I wanted to explain quickly what's the main idea of the flows, just to make easier the whole process. Like if you want to call Power Automate flow from Power Pages in the code, what you have to do is you build the request payload, and then you send that payload as a parameter in JavaScript via post request. Those parameters, they have to match the trigger parameters from the flow Power Pages trigger. And what's cool now is that you can also identify who is the user calling the flow, and you have more parameters to do some data manipulation inside of your Power Automate flow. So for example, based on the user that's calling the flow, you could then do some checks to see, okay, should the user be accessing that file or not, and any other rule you might want to implement just for increased security. And then after you do the work you want to do, like do your checks or connect to any external data source, you can return the response to Power Pages, and Power Pages processes the flow response with the JavaScript. So now enough of theory, I'm gonna jump into the demo. So here, what I have is simply a basic SharePoint library with a bunch of folders, with a bunch of files, and then there's one of the folders that is empty. There are folders here with subfolders. So I just wanted to show the in Power Pages as well that we can browse folder by folder and extract the contents. There are files here that I simply downloaded, like I searched on Microsoft Learns for PDF files just to use as examples, because I'm going to browse them and preview them from Power Pages as well, right? And here in my Power Pages site, there is a page. It's a very, very basic page with only one table on it. But when the page loads, my JavaScript code runs, calls the flows, calls the flow to list the files from SharePoint. And then I simply don't pass the folder as a parameter to the flow, which basically lists the root folder of my SharePoint library. So if I come here and click a folder to open it, I send the folder parameter to the flow, get the data, pass it back, and update my page. And the same happens when I browse a folder with content. So for instance, this one, I have the files inside the folder. I have a subfolder. If I click a subfolder, I can browse it. I can use the mimicated breadcrumb here to browse the folders and go back and forth. Then if the file is a PDF file, I have implemented other options as well. We have download option here where I can download any type of file, not only PDF files. It thinks a little bit. I think on this case, I've chosen a bad file because it's a big one. Downloads the file and then it's gonna pop over here in my another tab. Let's see. If it takes long, I'm gonna open another one. Yep, so it took a little bit to load, but you could see that I opened the release wave one for Power Platform. And obviously, if I want to preview in a new tab, I click that button, it runs, it opens the file on a new tab. So now that I've explored what I have in SharePoint, how it works in Power Pages, I want to show how you configure flows and how it looks. Then later I will explain how to. Sorry, I will explain how to call that via JavaScript. Inside of Power Pages now, guys, if you have a look at the setup workspace, there's this Cloud Flows option that's not in preview anymore, that you can add existing flows if you have any with the Power Pages trigger in the same environment of your Power Pages site, or you can create a new one from scratch. But in this case, I already have the example flows created. And then, as I mentioned, I have one flow that gets the SharePoint file content, another flow that lists the SharePoint folder contents. If you click here to edit the flow, you're going to see there's one option that's the flow URL. And that's what you need to copy and paste in your JavaScript code. And also you have the roles that you have to add to the flow. So what that means is there's something in Power Pages used for permissions that is called the web roles. If a person doesn't have a web role assigned, and if the web role assigned is not assigned, if the web role is not assigned to a flow, you cannot call the flow from JavaScript because you won't have access to it. So you have to add the person to a web role and then add that web role to the Power Automate flow. Inside of the Power Automate flow, for the SharePoint, for the flow to list the SharePoint folder contents, the idea is very basic. Like I try to make it very simple for illustrative purposes. So for example, you have a flow, you get a folder name as a parameter in the flow, then you simply run the SharePoint action to get files from a folder. So if you don't specify a folder, it's going to be blank. Then you call only the root folder of the library, return the value with all the files that you have in the folder as JSON to your Power Pages. And the same happens if you check the flow to download the contents from a file. So you send a file ID as a parameter to the flow, then another action, SharePoint action, gets the file and returns the file as base64 to the JavaScript code. If you want to edit your code, you have now an option that you can use to edit via VS Code, guys. I won't do it because it takes a little bit to load and it takes time. So if you can edit the Power Pages code via VS Code in the browser. It's in preview. But in my case here, I have already downloaded it locally. And the gist of it is that there's a web page in Power Pages, and you can edit it via VS Code and add anything custom you want. So in this case, it's basically a simple placeholder for my table with another one for the spinner to show the loading content, some inline styles as well. And in the JavaScript piece of code, what we have is the two flows stored as variables. So it's those addresses that you copy from Power Pages. Then there's this jQuery function that runs when the page loads, when the DOM contents are ready in the page. We run this function to load the SharePoint folder contents without a parameter. That function simply sets up the payload to send to the Power Automate flow. Then a function runs an Ajax post into Power Automate for that flow to get the folder content. And when it's successful, we're going to call this function generate SharePoint table. That is basically a function to parse the JSON data and do some checks. So for example, for each of the items we got from SharePoint, we simply check if the item is a folder. I'm going to add a button that calls again the same function to load the SharePoint folder contents, but now passing the path of the folder. Otherwise, if it's a file, I have a function here to open the SharePoint document. And if it's a PDF file, I'm adding a function here to same function to open the document, but just to add a new parameter to open the document in a new tab. And what this function to open the document does is the same idea as the other one, but now to get the file contents. So if we generate the payload to send to Power Automate, run the call, and now we just check if the file is preview, I do the download. If it's not preview, I run the file download. Otherwise, I open the file in a new tab. And those are simply functions to, so like the download base64 file, I generate a HTML auto-clickable element and force the download of the base64 content. In the second one, I'm simply generating a copy of the file locally and opening it in a new tab. So that's pretty much me, guys.